at violence, however. Faculty members at Washington State University had met with him just less than 2 weeks prior to the murders to talk with him about some growing concerns regarding the way he had been behaving. So in the hours before the murders, the four friends spent a typical Saturday night enjoying campus life. And on the evening of November 12th, 2022, Ethan, Chapin, and Zaina Noddle attended a party at a fraternity house, while Madison, Mogan, and Kaylee Goncalves went to a popular sports bar downtown. At around 1:30 a.m., Mogan and Goncalves were seen on a live stream at a local food truck. And they were just chatting and getting a late night snack before a ride service would pick them up at around 2 a.m. So by roughly 2 a.m., all four victims had returned to the girls' rental house and were presumably settling in for the night. But unbeknownst to them, an assailant was likely already approaching. And investigators would later allege that Bryan Kohberger's cell phone data placed him in the vicinity of the victim's neighborhood on a dozen occasions in the weeks prior to the murders. So it appeared the crime was not random, and the killer might have stalked the home in advance. So in the early morning hours of November 13th, the household fell silent. And two other young women, roommates who lived on the ground floor, initially had allegedly slept through the night, unaware of the horrors that were unfolding upstairs. Because sometime between 4 a.m. and 4:25 a.m. on November 13th, the killer would strike. Armed with a very large knife, the intruder entered the six-bedroom house in complete darkness. And the attacker moved from room to room, ambushing the four students. And autopsy findings later indicated that all four victims were likely asleep at the time of the attacks. And some would obviously wake up during the attacks and would put up a fight. And we know this because they had defensive wounds, but each was stabbed multiple times in a frenzy of violence. And the brutality of the crime was staggering, and the evidence at the scene suggested the killer was merciless and efficient. So it was extremely planned out. And one of the surviving roommates on the ground floor woke up during the attack, sensing that something was terribly wrong. And according to a police affidavit, this roommate walked out of her door and glimpsed a masked man dressed in black inside of the house. And she noted that he had bushy eyebrows peeking out from his mask as he passed her by. But in a state of shock and fear, she locked her door instead of calling 911. So the intruder fled into the night, and it wasn't until just before noon that same day, nearly 8 hours later, that 911 was called and finally alerted the police to an unconscious person at the King Road house. So responding officers walked into a nightmare because the four college friends were found dead in their bedrooms, and the scene was blood-soaked and chaotic. And investigators also discovered a crucial clue the killer left behind, which was a leather knife sheath lying on the bed next to one of the victims. And that sheath stamped with K-bar. And it had DNA traces that would later prove pivotal. So the college community was horrified as the news broke of a quadruple homicide, and rumors and fear spread fast because an apparent killer was on the loose. And for weeks, there seemed to be no suspect or motive. And memorial vigils were held for Madison, Kaylee, Zaina, and Ethan, even as police worked quietly behind the scenes to catch the person who was responsible. So the investigation into the University of Idaho murders became one of the most intense and scrutinized in recent memory. And Moscow police, assisted by state troopers and FBI agents, sifted through thousands of tips and pieces of evidence. And early on, surveillance videos from the neighborhood provided a lead. A white Hyundai Elantra was seen driving repeatedly near the crime scene around the time of the murders. So detectives traced registrations for that model car and discovered that Bryan Kohberger owned a white Hyundai Elantra and drove it cross-country to his parents' house in Pennsylvania shortly after the killings. Suspicious. And meanwhile, forensic testing on that knife sheath found at the house revealed DNA on the snap closure. So investigators would covertly collect garbage from the Kohberger family home in Pennsylvania, and they would obtain a DNA sample which closely matched the sheath DNA, indicating the sheath likely belonged to Bryan Kohberger. And they also surveyed Kohberger, often wearing surgical gloves and putting trash in plastic baggies and placing it in neighbors' trash cans. Suspicious. Okay, couldn't be more suspicious. And he also reportedly cleaned thoroughly the inside and outside of his car during this period. Suspicious. So this DNA and surveillance evidence gave police the break that they desperately needed. And on December 30th, 2022, 6 weeks after the murders, a SWAT team would move in and arrest the piece of shit Brian at his parents' home. And he was taken into custody on an active arrest warrant for 4 counts of first-degree murder and a felony burglary charge accused of breaking into a student's home with the intent to commit murder. So Kohberger was extradited swiftly back to Idaho in early January of 2023 to face his charges. And as the public learned of the suspect's identity, the story pulled them in because it was a criminology student suspected of committing this horrible crime. And law enforcement officials confirmed that the cell phone pings from Kohberger's phone showed that it was turned off during the time of the murders, which was, we assume, an attempt to evade tracking, because he had planned, obviously, a lot at this point, so that would be like the bare minimum. But it pinged in Moscow later on and had been near the victim's residence multiple times in prior months, so he's a f***ing idiot. In addition, Kohberger's campus apartments and office at WSU were searched, and his white Elantra was seized for evidence. And the wealth of digital, genetic, and video evidence gathered by investigators painted a damning picture connecting Kohberger to the crime. So Brian's case was now moving through the justice system, with many still closely watching, including my mother. She's the one who suggested I do this case. Shout out to Mom. She's the one that got me so interested in true crime. Shout out Mama Collins. And in May of 2023, a grand jury indicted Kohberger on 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for each victim, and 1 count of burglary. So at his arraignment, Kohberger chose to stand silent, meaning he did not enter a plea himself. And consequently, the judge entered a plea of not guilty on his behalf. So prosecutors announced that they will seek the death penalty if Kohberger is convicted, given the gruesome nature of his crime. Because Idaho is one of the 27 states that permit capital punishment, and this case certainly qualifies for that, in the state's view. And the pretrial proceedings have been extensive. And Kohberger's defense team has filed numerous motions, including efforts to challenge evidence. Notably, they argued to exclude testimony about the eyewitness roommate's description of the intruder's bushy eyebrows, claiming that that detail might unfairly prejudice the jury. She's just saying what she saw, and she saw bushy f***ing eyebrows on this evil f***ing dude. I gotta stop. I gotta calm down. He's not guilty yet, but he is. I don't know. He's not technically, allegedly he's guilty. Allegedly innocent until proven guilty, though. I gotta be careful. The prosecutors responded that such description is factual and should be allowed in the jury's consideration, which I agree with. The prosecutors, for their part, have revealed additional evidence they plan to use, such as Kohberger's own online activity. And court filings indicate Kohberger had purchased a K-bar knife and sheath on Amazon about 8 months before the murders, and that he oddly searched online for K-bar knives in the days after the stabbings. So he was getting a new knife because he forgot his f***ing sheath at the house. Like this case is just puzzling together so perfectly. It's insane. And they even say that Kohberger snapped a selfie photo on his phone at 10:31 a.m. on November 13th, 2022, just hours after killing, in which he is smiling. Disgusting. And this photo shows his face and eyebrows clearly that morning and might be shown to the jurors to compare with the roommate's account. And due to the intense pretrial publicity and community impact, the judge granted a change of venue, and the trial moved out of a small college town of Moscow to a state capital of Boise, Idaho, in hopes of finding an impartial jury. And a sweeping gag order was imposed, barring attorneys and law enforcement from speaking about the case publicly. Doesn't involve me, though. I'm here to say I think it's a piece of shit, and I think he might be allegedly guilty, but we don't know yet, so I can't say anything for legal reasons. And also, cameras will not be allowed in the courtroom during the trial. And as of mid-2025, the trial has not yet begun. In fact, it has been scheduled to start with jury selection in late July 2025, with opening statements expected by August 11th, 2025. You bet your ass I'll keep us up to date, okay? And Kohberger, now 30 years old, remains jailed awaiting his day in court. And he maintains his innocence through his attorneys. And the families of the 4